What if you lived in a world where your very existence was judged by ancient whispers and rigid rules? What if the year was 1078 and the world saw women through a lens of fear, control, and bizarre assumptions? What if your worth was dictated not by your actions, but by the deeply ingrained beliefs of a society steeped in tradition and suspicion? Get ready to step back in time and uncover the shocking stereotypes that held women captive, shaping their lives in ways you might never imagine. Number 1. Women as inherently sinful and temptresses. Imagine a world where your very being was tainted by an ancient tale, a story told and retold from pulpits and through whispered legends. This was the crushing reality for women in 1078, a time when the powerful narrative of Eve and the serpent cast a long, dark shadow over the female sex. It was not merely a story, it was a foundational justification for a stereotype so pervasive. It seeped into every corner of society, portraying women as inherently more susceptible to temptation, and thus a potential source of sin for men. Church, a dominant force in medieval life, played a colossal role in perpetuating this image. Sermons, delivered by priests in every village and town, frequently reminded congregations of Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. She was not just a historical figure, she was a symbolic representation of female weakness, a cautionary tale that seemed to suggest all women carried a portion of her original fault. It was a narrative designed to control, to limit, and to constantly remind women of their perceived moral frailty. Picture a crowded, incense-filled church, the stern voice of the priest echoing through the stone arches, recounting how Eve, swayed by the serpent's wily words, led Adam to disobedience, bringing sin into the world. This narrative wasn't just listened to, it was absorbed, becoming part of the collective understanding of womanhood. This stereotype wasn't just abstract theology, it had tangible impacts on daily life. Women were often seen as a constant source of temptation, a distraction from piety and virtue. Their very beauty, their charm, their presence could be viewed with suspicion. For a man seeking spiritual purity, interaction with women could be considered a dangerous path, a potential fall from grace. This mindset contributed to the strict segregation often seen in monasteries and convents, but also subtly influenced social interactions in secular life. A woman's gaze, her laughter, even her simple presence, could be interpreted through this lens of potential seduction and sin. It placed an immense burden on women, forcing them into a defensive posture, constantly aware of how their actions might be misinterpreted as leading others astray. The writings of church fathers, centuries old yet still profoundly influential in the 11th century, reinforced these ideas. Figures like Tertullian, though living in an earlier age, famously labeled women as the devil's gateway. This stark and terrifying portrayal was not forgotten. It echoed through scholastic texts, commentaries, and oral traditions, shaping attitudes towards women in the medieval period. Imagine being born into a world where such a damning label, uttered by revered theological minds, was widely accepted. It created an environment where women's bodies, their sexuality, and even their natural inclinations were viewed with suspicion, as potential conduits for evil rather than sources of life or love. This fear of female temptation manifested in various ways. Religious art, whether in illuminated manuscripts or nascent stained glass, often depicted Eve as the instigator, her hand reaching for the forbidden fruit, while Adam appeared more passive, almost a victim. These images, seen by literate and illiterate alike, visually reinforced the sermon's message, embedding it into the collective consciousness. It wasn't about individual guilt, it was about an inherent propensity, a flaw woven into the very being of womanhood. This played a role in the emphasis on female purity and virginity, which became paramount virtues. A virgin was seen as untainted, closer to the Virgin Mary, and therefore less influenced by the Eve-like tendency towards sin. For those who were not virgins, especially wives, the burden of moral responsibility often fell heavily upon them to maintain virtue and not lead their husbands astray. The stereotype also informed social codes of conduct. Women were expected to be modest in dress, reserved in demeanor, and submissive to male authority. These expectations were not just about decorum, they were often framed as safeguards against female temptation, protecting both men from sin and women from succumbing to their own perceived weaknesses. A woman who was too outspoken, too independent, or too bold might be seen as dangerous, a threat to the established order, possibly because she was not conforming to the expected submissive role designed to keep her tempting nature in check. Her deviation from the norm could be linked to an unholy influence. Even monastic asceticism, which sought to control earthly desires for spiritual gain, contributed to this stereotype. Monks sworn to celibacy often viewed women as the primary obstacle to their spiritual journey. Their writings and teachings, while promoting personal piety, often cast women in a negative light as the embodiment of worldly temptations. This perspective, while extreme, seeped into wider societal views, reinforcing the idea that women were inherently linked to the material, the carnal, and thus the sinful. The ideal woman, therefore, became one who was almost invisible, or at least, entirely focused on domestic and spiritual duties that kept her away from public life and potential temptation. The implications of this stereotype were profound. It undermined women's spiritual authority, suggesting they needed constant male guidance to stay on the path of righteousness. It fueled suspicion and mistrust, making it harder for women to achieve positions of influence or respect outside very narrow, carefully defined roles. It was a narrative that perpetually cast women in a defensive light, forcing them to navigate a world that already presumed their inherent sinfulness and their capacity to lead others into error. This deep-seated belief, woven into the very spiritual and social tapestry of 1078, profoundly shaped the lives, opportunities, and self-perception of every woman, from the queen in her castle to the peasant in her hut. It was a silent, powerful judge, forever reminding women of their supposed moral flaw, a legacy of Eve's ancient choice. Number 2, women as intellectually inferior or incapable of reason. Step into a medieval classroom, or rather, imagine one, because in 1078, the chances of seeing a woman there, especially in any serious scholarly pursuit, were astronomically low. This wasn't because women lacked intelligence. It was because a deeply ingrained stereotype dictated that they were intellectually inferior, inherently incapable of the rigorous thought and pure reason that was deemed essential for true knowledge. Prevailing belief was that women were primarily creatures of emotion, prone to flights of fancy and easily swayed by sentiment, rather than possessing the stable, logical minds necessary for academic or philosophical endeavors. The exclusion of women from formal education was a glaring manifestation of this stereotype. Great centers of learning in the 11th century were overwhelmingly monasteries, and as they began to emerge, nascent universities. These institutions were almost exclusively male domains. While some aristocratic women might receive basic literacy from private tutors, and nuns in convents might learn to read and write for religious purposes, access to advanced theological, philosophical, legal, or scientific texts was largely denied. Imagine being eager to learn, to delve into the mysteries of the world, only to be told that your mind was simply not built for such complex pursuits. It was a societal barrier, built on the assumption that women's intellectual capacities were fundamentally limited, suited only for domestic management, spiritual devotion, or the raising of children. Scholastic thought, which was gaining momentum in this period, often drew upon classical texts and interpretations that reinforced this hierarchy of intellect. Philosophers and theologians, almost all men, frequently posited a natural order in which male rationality stood supreme, while female emotionality was seen as a hindrance to true understanding. The influential sentences of Peter Lombard, though written later in the 12th century, built upon and disseminated ideas that were already circulating in the 11th century, ideas that suggested women were less suited for intellectual rigor due to their perceived emotional nature. This wasn't just a casual opinion, it was often presented as a natural, almost divinely ordained truth. This stereotype meant that women were largely excluded from legal and political discourse. Their voices were not considered authoritative in matters of law, governance, or even significant property disputes. While noblewomen might manage estates in their husband's absence, their authority was typically delegated and temporary, not inherent. They were seen as administrators, not lawmakers or strategic thinkers. A woman's counsel, even if wise, might be dismissed simply because it came from a female mind, presumed to be less rational and more prone to bias or sentiment. Picture a gathering of powerful men debating policy or strategy. The idea of a woman contributing meaningfully to such a discussion would have been almost unthinkable, seen as contrary to the very nature of things. The role of female eloquence was also often viewed with suspicion. While women were expected to be pious and perhaps skilled in domestic arts, An overly articulate or argumentative woman might be seen as transgressing her natural boundaries. Her words, even if logical, could be dismissed as mere chatter or emotional outbursts. This limited women's ability to advocate for themselves or influence decisions in the public sphere, forcing them to rely on male intermediaries or use indirect methods of persuasion. It was a subtle form of censorship, not through direct prohibition, but through the devaluation of female speech itself. Even within the context of religious life, where some women found intellectual outlets in convents, their contributions were often viewed differently than those of male scholars. While figures like Hildegard of Bingen would later emerge as intellectual powerhouses, they were exceptional and often faced challenges simply because they were women attempting to engage in spheres traditionally reserved for men. The vast monastic libraries, repositories of knowledge, and centers of copying and study were predominantly accessible to male scholars. While female contemplative orders had their own libraries, the scope and depth of their collections were often more limited, focused primarily on devotional texts rather than extensive philosophical or scientific works, as indicated by catalog inventories from houses like Quedlinburg Abbey. This unequal access reinforced the idea that profound knowledge was a male pursuit. The stereotype also influenced how women were educated, even within the home. Girls were taught skills deemed appropriate for their future roles: household management, spinning, weaving, childcare, and basic religious instruction. While these skills were essential for the functioning of medieval society, they were rarely accompanied by the kind of intellectual training that would encourage abstract thought, critical analysis, or philosophical inquiry. The emphasis was on practical competence and moral uprightness, not intellectual development in the broader sense. A young woman might be taught to read devotional texts, but rarely to engage in theological debate or historical analysis. The lack of recognized female intellectual contribution meant that women's perspectives were largely absent from the historical record, further cementing the idea that they had nothing significant to contribute. Chronicles, legal documents, and theological treatises of the time were almost exclusively written by men, reflecting a male-centric worldview that often marginalized or entirely overlooked female experiences and thoughts. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Because women weren't seen as intellectual, they weren't educated in formal settings. Because they weren't formally educated, their contributions weren't recorded. And because their contributions weren't recorded, the stereotype of their intellectual inferiority persisted. It was a clever, cruel trick of history, built on a prejudice that profoundly limited the potential of half the population in the year 1078. Number 3. Women as property or chattel. Imagine a world where your very identity, your social standing, and your future were not truly your own, but rather a commodity to be transferred, traded, or inherited. This was the stark reality for many women in 1078, a period when legal codes and societal norms frequently reduced them to the status of property or chattel, their worth inextricably tied to male ownership and lineage. From birth to death, a woman's life was often dictated by a series of male guardians, father, husband, and even brother, who held sway over her decisions, her body, and her destiny. Dowry system, a cornerstone of medieval marriage, vividly illustrates this concept. A woman's family would provide a portion of wealth, land, or goods to her husband upon marriage. This was not just a gift, it was a transfer of resources that essentially compensated the husband for taking on the responsibility of the woman, and it often determined the desirability and status of the marriage. The woman herself was part of this transaction, her value intertwined with the size and prestige of her dowry. Personal desires, her affections, her wishes for a partner were often secondary, or even irrelevant, compared to the strategic advantages a marriage could bring to her family's fortunes or political alliances. Picture a negotiation between two powerful families discussing the marriage of their children. The young woman might be present, but her voice would likely be absent, her future being decided by male relatives who saw her as a valuable asset to be deployed for dynastic gain. Arranged marriages were the norm across all social strata, from peasant to nobility. For noblewomen, marriages were crucial political and economic alliances, cementing power, securing land, or ending feuds. Chroniclers, in detailing noble lineages and political maneuverings, often listed women as instruments of alliance through marriage, their personal desires secondary to dynastic ambitions, a recurring theme in the Gesta Francorum and similar histories of the period. A noble daughter might be sent hundreds of miles from her home to a foreign court to marry a man she had never met, all in the name of her family's strategic interests. Her body, her fertility, and her future children were not her own, but rather a means to continue a male lineage or solidify a political bond. The legal codes of the time, such as those that evolved from Germanic traditions or early canon law, frequently defined women's status in relation to a male guardian. This concept, known as mundium in some legal systems, meant that a woman almost always remained under the legal guardianship of a man. Before marriage, she was under the mundium of her father. Upon marriage, it transferred to her husband. Widowed, it might pass to a brother, an uncle, or even an adult son. This lack of legal agency meant that women could not typically own property independently, enter into contracts, or represent themselves in court without the consent and involvement of their male guardian. Imagine needing your father's or husband's permission for almost every significant act, from buying a piece of land to defending your own character in a dispute. Inheritance laws further cemented this view. While a daughter might receive a dowry, sons were generally preferred as heirs to land and titles, ensuring the continuity of the male line. Even when women did inherit, particularly in the absence of male heirs, their control was often limited or temporary, and the property might eventually revert to the male line. The idea was to keep wealth and power within the male lineage, passing it from father to son. This practice reinforced the notion that women were not truly independent economic agents, but rather temporary custodians of family wealth, to be managed by men. Distant land deeds and wills from regions like the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire often illustrate these patterns of inheritance, where women's rights were typically secondary to men's. The control extended even to a woman's reproductive capacity. Bearing children, especially sons, was often seen as a primary duty of a wife, essential for continuing the family name and securing its future. A woman who failed to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, might face immense pressure, social scorn, or even be set aside or divorced. Her body was, in many ways, an extension of her husband's property, vital for the production of his legacy. Pain and dangers of childbirth were endured, not just for the sake of a new life, but often under the intense scrutiny of a family and society desperate for a male successor. The demeaning aspect of this stereotype was that it stripped women of their individual personhood. They were not viewed as independent moral or legal agents, but as instruments for the continuation of male lines, the transfer of wealth, or the forging of alliances. Their feelings, aspirations, and individual identities were often subsumed by their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers, always in relation to a man. It was a world where a woman's worth was often calculated in terms of land, lineage, and the children she could bear, rather than her intellect, her character, or her spirit. This reduced a complex human being to a valuable, yet controlled possession, a deeply ingrained reality that shaped the lives of countless women in 1078. Number 4. Women as physically weak or frail. Picture the bustling life of a medieval village in 1078. Men toiled in the fields, swung axes in the forest, or trained with weapons. Women, too, were constantly busy, but the nature of their labor and the prevailing societal views often cast them as inherently physically weak and frail. This wasn't merely a polite observation. It was a deeply ingrained stereotype that shaped labor divisions, expectations, and even rudimentary medical understandings of the female body. It dictated what women were deemed capable of doing, subtly limiting their roles and reinforcing their perceived dependence on men for protection and heavy labor. The societal expectation was that men were the physically dominant sex, naturally suited for demanding physical tasks, warfare, and heavy agricultural work. While women undeniably performed arduous labor in the medieval world, spinning, weaving, grinding grain, tending livestock, and managing households, these tasks were often categorized differently. They were seen as domestic, supporting the male effort, or requiring a different kind of endurance rather than brute strength. Imagine a field being plowed. It would invariably be a man guiding the oxen, while a woman might follow, sowing seeds or weeding. This division wasn't just practical. It was reinforced by the belief that women lacked the necessary physical prowess for sustained, heavy outdoor work. Contemporary medical treatises, albeit rudimentary by modern standards, contributed to these notions of physical delicacy. Influenced by ancient Greek theories, these texts often describe the female body as inherently colder and wetter than the male, a humoral imbalance believed to result in a weaker constitution. The work of Constantinus Africanus, whose translations of Arabic medical texts were beginning to influence Western medicine around this time, might have reinforced these anatomical and physiological interpretations, inadvertently solidifying ideas about female frailty. This wasn't just medical observation, it was a philosophical framework that provided a scientific basis for perceived female weakness. If your very biology was considered inherently weaker, then your capacity for physically demanding roles would naturally be questioned. This stereotype had tangible consequences for women's roles in warfare and defense. While some exceptional women, typically noblewomen, might have defended castles in their husband's absence, these were rare circumstances born of necessity. The primary role of warfare, military training, and defense was unequivocally male. Feudal charters outlining duties and responsibilities rarely assigned physically demanding roles in the public or military sphere to women, reserving them for male vassals or serfs, as documented in various regional manorial records from the era. Women were seen as needing protection, not providing. This perception further cemented the idea of their physical vulnerability and their reliance on male protectors. Picture a knight in shining armor. The stereotype positioned women as the damsels to be rescued, not the warriors doing the rescue. The expectation of female frailty also influenced fashion and social comportment. Women's clothing, though practical for their daily tasks, often involved multiple layers, long skirts, and often head coverings, which, while offering warmth and modesty, could also limit movement in ways that male attire did not. The ideal female posture was often depicted as demure and graceful, reinforcing an image of delicacy rather than robust strength. To be seen as unfeminine, too strong, too robust, too active, could carry a social stigma, implying a deviation from what was considered proper and natural for a woman. Even childbirth, a process of immense physical endurance, was often framed within the context of female suffering and vulnerability, rather than as a testament to female strength. While midwives were essential, the process was fraught with danger, and women were seen as enduring a perilous ordeal that underscored their physical weakness in the face of nature's demands. The high mortality rates for women in childbirth further reinforced the idea of their inherent fragility. It was a time when female bodies were understood as delicate vessels, prone to illness and less resilient than male bodies. This stereotype extended beyond the purely physical realm, often subtly influencing perceptions of emotional and mental resilience as well. Women were physically frail. It was often assumed they were also emotionally sensitive and less able to withstand hardship or pressure. This added another layer to the narrative of female vulnerability, suggesting a need for constant male supervision and protection. It was a world where a woman's physical capacity was constantly underestimated, where her potential was often limited by preconceived notions of her delicate nature, and where her strength, though often immense in the face of daily life, was rarely acknowledged or celebrated in the same way as a man's. The physical world of 1078, with its demands and dangers, was largely seen as a man's domain, with women occupying a more sheltered, and thus weaker, space. Number 5. Women as gossips and untrustworthy with secrets. Imagine a close-knit medieval community in 1078, where reputation was everything, and whispers could destroy a life. In this world, a pervasive stereotype held that women were inherently prone to gossip, unable to keep secrets, and therefore untrustworthy with sensitive information. This wasn't just a casual jab, it was a serious accusation rooted in the perceived emotional nature of women and a desire to control their speech and social interaction. It implied that women, due to their supposed lack of rational control, were conduits for rumors and discord, posing a threat to community harmony and male authority. This stereotype was often linked to the idea that women were overly emotional and thus lacked the discipline to guard confidential information. While men were considered capable of rational thought and strategic discretion, women were seen as easily swayed by feelings, personal relationships, or even sheer boredom, leading them to divulge secrets. Sermons of the period, often delivered by local priests, frequently admonished parishioners against the idle chatter of women, warning of its corrosive effect on community harmony. These admonitions, which circulated through episcopal letters and general church teachings, subtly, or not so subtly, targeted women's perceived loquaciousness. A priest might warn his flock about the dangers of a woman's tongue, painting it as a weapon more dangerous than any sword, capable of sowing discord and suspicion. The social roles of women in medieval society, particularly those centered around domestic life and communal gatherings, also inadvertently contributed to this stereotype. Women often gathered for tasks like spinning, weaving, or washing clothes, forming social networks where news and information, both trivial and significant, were exchanged. While these gatherings were vital for community cohesion and support, they were also viewed with suspicion by those who feared the spread of rumors. The stereotype suggested that women, when together, would inevitably engage in hen talk, leading to gossip and the careless revelation of personal matters. Picture a group of women at the communal well, sharing news of births, deaths, and marriages. The stereotype twisted this necessary social interaction into a potential source of danger, where vital secrets could be carelessly spilled. This perception meant that women were often excluded from sensitive discussions, especially those concerning politics, property, or family honor. If a matter required absolute discretion, a woman's presence might be deemed a liability. This limited their participation in important family and community decisions, reinforcing their subordinate status and diminishing their perceived trustworthiness. A husband might carefully guard financial details or political maneuverings from his wife, not out of malice, but out of a genuine belief that she simply couldn't be trusted to keep quiet, no matter how much he loved her. This wasn't just about grand secrets of state. It extended to everyday affairs, making women privy only to information deemed safe for their ear. In literature and popular tales of the time, the character of the gossiping woman often appeared as a figure of ridicule or a source of comedic chaos. While these portrayals might have been intended as entertainment, they deeply ingrained the stereotype into the cultural consciousness. These stories, whether oral or in early written forms, served as cautionary tales, reinforcing the idea that a woman's tongue was her greatest vice. Such depictions, while perhaps not formal citations, were powerful cultural references that shaped public perception and expectations. The emphasis on female silence and obedience, often preached from the pulpit, also related to this stereotype. A woman who spoke little, who was reserved and demure, was seen as virtuous and trustworthy. Conversely, a woman who was too outspoken, too curious, or too engaged in conversation could be seen as dangerous, a potential carrier of rumor. This created a subtle pressure for women to self-censor, to choose their words carefully, and to avoid appearing too engaged in public discourse, lest they be branded as a gossip. This stereotype had real implications for women's social standing and their ability to forge meaningful relationships based on trust and confidence. It meant that a woman's word was often viewed with a degree of skepticism, and her insights might be dismissed as mere hearsay rather than reasoned judgment. While women, like all people, can indeed gossip, this stereotype elevated it to an inherent female flaw, painting women as universally untrustworthy with secrets. It was a demeaning label that served to control women's voices, limit their access to information, and reinforce a patriarchal system where men were the guardians of wisdom and discretion, and women were merely the bearers of idle talk, a persistent and damaging perception in 1078. Number 6. Women as supernaturally dangerous or prone to witchcraft. Imagine a chill wind sweeping through a medieval village in 1078, carrying not just the scent of wood smoke, but also whispers of unseen forces. In this world, an insidious stereotype often cast women as supernaturally dangerous, particularly prone to witchcraft, or at the very least, easily swayed by malevolent spiritual influences. While the peak of witch hunts was still centuries away, the seeds of suspicion towards women, especially those who were independent, knew about herbs, or simply didn't fit neatly into societal expectations, were already sown deep in the medieval mind. This wasn't about individual moral failing. It was about an inherent vulnerability to evil, a perceived closer connection to dark forces that made women a potential threat to the community's spiritual and physical well-being. This stereotype was closely intertwined with the pervasive narrative of Eve's sinfulness, as discussed earlier. Women were seen as inherently weaker in faith, more susceptible to temptation, then it was a logical, though flawed, step to assume they would also be more vulnerable to demonic influence or even active collaboration with dark powers. Canon Episcopi, an earlier ecclesiastical text whose ideas still echoed through medieval thought, warned against belief in night-riding women and other superstitions, yet its very existence highlighted the underlying fear and belief in female involvement with such mystical practices. Though it sought to debunk popular superstitions, it simultaneously acknowledged their prevalence and often linked them to female figures. Folk beliefs and local superstitions, deeply embedded in the rural communities of 1078, often featured female figures as practitioners of both beneficial and harmful magic. While many women served as village healers, skilled in herbal remedies and traditional medicine, this knowledge, when viewed through the lens of suspicion, could easily be reinterpreted as sorcery. A woman who knew too much about herbs, who could ease pain or even cause illness, might be seen as dabbling in forces beyond human comprehension. Her healing touch, if a patient's condition worsened, could be labeled as a curse. Picture a respected elder woman in a village, sought out for her wisdom in healing. One day, a sudden illness strikes after she has visited a home, and the whispers begin. Did she truly heal, or did she bewitch? The very concept of a woman's power was often viewed with a degree of apprehension. If a woman held unusual influence, possessed an unexplained knowledge, or exhibited behavior outside the prescribed norms, it could be attributed to supernatural means. This was particularly true for women who lived alone, widows, or those who were perceived as eccentric. Their independence, a challenge to the patriarchal order, could be explained away as a result of unholy alliances. Local capitularies, which were collections of laws and regulations, though not widespread in their direct accusations of witchcraft in the 11th century, sometimes touched upon practices deemed unchristian or pagan, often implying that female practitioners were involved. This subtle connection between non-Christian practices and female figures created an environment where suspicion could easily fester. The imagery of the crone, or the old hag in folklore, often carried connotations of malevolence and magical power, further cementing the stereotype of the dangerous older woman. These figures, often marginalized by society, became easy targets for fear and suspicion, embodying the perceived negative spiritual power of women. It was a projection of anxieties onto those who were already vulnerable and outside the established male-dominated hierarchy. This stereotype contributed to the pervasive fear of female sexuality, particularly unregulated or wild sexuality. If a woman was seen as alluring, seductive, or if she held sway over men, her power might be interpreted as unnatural, possibly derived from demonic influence. The ancient fear of the succubus, a demonic entity that takes female form to tempt men, echoed this underlying anxiety about the seductive, potentially dangerous power of women. The idea was that women were not just susceptible to sin themselves, but could actively lead men to their spiritual ruin through unholy means. In a world where natural phenomena were often attributed to spiritual forces, and where Christian dogma was deeply interwoven with daily life, any deviation from the expected order could be seen as an act of the devil. Too often, women were identified as the easier target, the weaker vessel, for the devil's insidious work. This demeaning stereotype painted women not just as morally fragile, but as actively capable of supernatural harm, making them objects of fear and suspicion, and forever holding over their heads the terrifying possibility of being branded as a witch, a deeply unsettling reality that shadowed the lives of women in 1078.